Hey everyone, today I want to get to the bottom of the ongoing debate about what Dungeons & Dragons is. It seems everyone has their own ideas about what D&D is, and some are particularly adamant that their definition is the only one with merit. Well, let's go through the facts available to us and see where that gets us. If you enjoy these videos, please click like and subscribe to the channel, and definitely let me know your thoughts down in the comments. We can't start this quest until we define the problem. You see, Dungeons & Dragons has been around for 50 years and has gone through a lot of changes. On top of this, the game is built on the notion of homebrewed content, where each table inserts their own unique ideas into the game to make it something special for them. With 5 decades of official content and millions of players, how can we define what Dungeons & Dragons actually is? Ultimately, the answer to this question lies in the film world, but I'll get to that in a little bit. Let's start this quest at the beginning. 1974, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson are fans of miniature war games. In fact, they have their own rule set called Chainmail that encompasses the parts of such games that they enjoy the most. But they want something more. They want some additional rules that go beyond armies and nameless pawns on a battlefield. They want to actually create characters for their game. Out of this desire is born the Dungeons & Dragons fantasy role-playing game. But that's not quite right. The official title is Dungeons & Dragons Rules for Fantastic Medieval War Games, campaigns playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. This original version of Dungeons & Dragons was not even really a standalone product. It was a supplement for their chainmail system. You needed the chainmail rules in order to actually run the combat. What this supplement offered was a set of rules that allow you to build a character with some specific abilities. These were your heroes. They would lead the armies that fought in the war games, and then you could take those heroes on smaller side quests to fight other enemies and find treasure. Some of the mechanics, like ability scores and hit points, are found in here, but much of the book would be foreign to the modern D&D player. D20s are not nearly as prevalent, advantage and disadvantage is not a thing, spellcasting worked completely differently, dwarfs and elves were classes rather than races. It was definitely different, but it also became very popular. Within a few years, it became clear that more structure and content was needed for these rules. They needed a better system for introducing the game to new players, and it needed to be its own game rather than a supplement to Chainmail. Enter the Basic version by John Eric Holmes. This book would contain everything that a new player would need to get started. Around the same time, Gary Gygax was working on the Advanced D&D rules. These covered more ground than the basic rules and were for those players that wanted a more immersive experience. As a result of these different approaches, the early 80s saw some diverging paths in the game. The Basic Edition was reworked and expanded to be a Basic and Expert set. This is now referred to as Basic Expert, or BX. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons was released using the 3 core rulebooks that we are familiar with today, and then Frank Mentzner put together an entirely new collection of rules referred to today as BECMI, Basic, Expert, Companion, Master, and Immortal. Each was an expansion of the rules to allow for more complex campaigns. So during the 1980s, we had essentially 3 D&D paths: BX, Advanced D&D, and BECMI. They were more or less compatible with each other, but took slightly different approaches to the game. To this day, there are fans that swear by one particular variant. I can talk for hours about each of these variants, but for the purposes of our current quest, one critical thing came out of these editions. In the 1981 Basic set, the very first section made the first attempts to explicitly define what D&D was. Dungeons & Dragons Fantasy Adventure Game is a role-playing adventure game for persons 10 years and older. In the D&D rules, individuals play the role of characters in a fantasy world where magic is real and heroes venture out on dangerous quests in search of fame and fortune. Characters gain experience by overcoming perils and recovering treasures. As characters gain experience, they grow in power and ability. At least 2 persons are needed to play this game, though the game is most enjoyable when played by a group of 4 to 8 people. This game, unlike others, does not use a playing board or actual playing pieces. All that is needed to play are these rules, the dice included in this set, pencil and paper, graph paper, and imagination. The game may be more exciting if miniature lead figures of the characters and monsters are used, but the game can be played without such aids. We now had a definition of what they were after, and you can see that most of what's contained within this definition can apply to every edition of Dungeons & Dragons before and since. It boils down to a game about fantasy role-playing and combat. Now, this video is not meant to be a full history of the game, but I think it's important to touch on some of the changes that followed. By the end of the 1980s, D&D had grown quite a bit, but it was still on those multiple paths. There was not really a single thing called Dungeons & Dragons, but rather 3 different products. It was desired to unite all the variants into a single edition of the game. We then got Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition in 1989. The rules from the other editions were consolidated and refined. Early on in the player's handbook for 2nd edition, it acknowledges how difficult it is to define a role-playing game. Such games are not binary. They do not have hard and fast rules where you do this and then this happens. All results are based on the players making cooperative decisions and the dungeon master ruling on what happens. Because of this flexibility, it is likely that no two tables would look the same even while playing the same adventure. But while the mechanics were evolving, the game itself was still about fantasy characters facing off against enemies to resolve quests, earn treasure, and gain more advanced abilities. The core definition of the game that was established in the original rules continued even as the interpretation and implementation of that definition changed with this new release. Another decade passed, and it was time again to refine the rules. While 2nd edition strove to consolidate and improve the assorted rules that came before it, 3rd edition aimed to streamline the rules to make the game more approachable for everyone. Enter the D20 system. In prior versions, the D20 was just another die that was used along with many others to make rulings, but in 3rd edition it became the core mechanic. The percentage die was used much less, and instead D20s were rolling everywhere. We got more defined races and classes, ability modifiers were now a thing, and skills were introduced. Many of the game mechanics that we know of today come from 3rd edition more so than in the versions that came before it. 3rd edition was not without its flaws though. 2nd edition was built on 15 years of Dungeons & Dragons experience, with multiple variants serving as test beds for what worked and what did not. 3rd edition was a complete redesign of many of the mechanics, and that led to some problems. Characters and monsters would get overpowered as they leveled up. Some configurations were not powerful enough. It was enough of an issue that within 3 years, a new version was needed. Enter 3.5. This version addressed many of the problems, and it did it so well that this edition still has an enormous following to this day. And as with 2nd edition, even though the mechanics of the game were substantially changed, we still see those core elements that have been with Dungeons & Dragons from the beginning. Dwarfs, elves, fighters, thieves, clerics, fantastical adventures, pencil and paper character sheets. It's all still there. 3rd edition is yet another interpretation of the core fantasy role-playing definition. In 2008, we got another take on the game. 2nd edition consolidated and improved the rules. 3rd edition streamlined and standardized the rules. 4th edition would strive to take this a step further by leaning heavy into the mechanics while embracing some of the new internet technology that was becoming available. Most of the core rules from 3rd edition remained, but how those rules were implemented changed. The biggest change was that instead of class features, we now had powers. I have other videos that expand on some of those ideas, so I'm not going to get too far into it here. I will just say that it was another huge change of direction for the game, and not everyone was happy about it, and some are still not happy about it. But if we set aside the mechanical changes to the game, what we see is dwarfs and fighters and clerics and skills and abilities and fantasy campaigns with characters seeking treasure and recognition. Under the covers is that same core fantasy role-playing game right there where it always was. Next we get to 5th edition. This version resembled 3rd edition and got rid of a lot of the innovations that 4th edition offered, but now we really start to get away from the pencil and paper. We have digital books and online character sheets and virtual tabletops. This opened up the game to tons of new players. It was definitely different from where the game started back in 1974, but it still had all those same core elements of fantasy role-playing. Which brings us to today. A new revision of Dungeons & Dragons is on the horizon. It will be compatible with 5th edition, but at the same time it will be very different from that version. So in all, we have 50 years of Dungeons & Dragons with substantial changes along the way. How can we possibly say which one of these is Dungeons & Dragons? Is Dungeons & Dragons only the original and everything else is just an imitation? Is Dungeons & Dragons only the most recent version and what came prior are just artifacts? To answer this, let's look at the movies. The James Bond franchise has been around for nearly 60 years. The core elements have remained. A spy battles evil in the world. The actors have changed, the types of stories have changed, the way of telling those stories has changed, but the essence of James Bond remains. The same is true of Star Trek and Star Wars and Fast and Furious. And we get similar variations when we have special editions of movies and director's cuts and reboots of classics. I love the remake of The Italian Job. I've seen the original film and I think it's kind of boring, but others swear by the original and think the remake is a travesty. I love Star Trek Next Generation, and I like the other variations of Star Trek to differing degrees. I think Empire Strikes Back is a cinematic masterpiece, and I can't watch the prequels. But others will disagree on all of these opinions, and I'm perfectly fine with that. You put 10 people in a room to discuss any topic and you're going to get 10 different opinions. Even those that agree will agree for different reasons. As was stated in the 2nd edition Player's Handbook, role-playing games are hard to define. The original rules said that Dungeons & Dragons was a war game with miniatures. The BX rules summed it up nicely, if generically. Most of the other versions made no attempt to explicitly define it, perhaps recognizing that what it means is different for each person. James Bond films are spy adventures. Star Trek is current moral questions told through the lens of a possible future. Star Wars is epic space battles between good and evil. The Italian Job is a group of thieves stealing gold. The interpretations of these franchises has changed over the years. Each interpretation has their fans. You can love or hate specific interpretations, but they are all equally part of the franchise. Dungeons & Dragons is about fantasy role-playing. What that means and how it is implemented has changed substantially over the years with each new edition. But they are all Dungeons & Dragons, and there are so many derivatives of D&D that it has become a generic term that can be applied to any number of other fantasy role-playing games out there. We all have our favorite, and we are all correct. So, what is Dungeons & Dragons? It's not rules, it's not mechanics, it's not lore. It's the only thing that has consistently been a part of every edition of the game. A fantasy role-playing game that you play with a group of your friends. Beyond that, you can define it as broadly or as narrowly as you like, but those definitions belong to you and you alone. Whatever your favorite version of Dungeons & Dragons is, embrace it and ignore those that try to tell you that you're wrong. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts on this subject down in the comments. Until next time, take care.